Google Gemini. This is the big topic that everyone has been talking about for 100 different reasons over the last few weeks. We've done episodes on this. Google Gemini has had a ton of controversy with their AI models and their image generations, and Google's now backpedaling and their stock price is crashing. There's a lot going on, and this isn't necessarily just a big doom episode on Google. What we actually wanted to talk about first is the fact that Conor got early access to Google Gemini. He was able to test it out before, the general public and everyone else. And he's got some interesting takeaways, some interesting insights, and then we want to talk about some of the implications, of course, everything that's going on as well. Conor, tell us about your experience.
Yeah, so this is wild, right? So I was so through a friend, a mutual friend of ours, I got Google kind of called me up and said, "Hey, do you want to test this early?" So this is their 1.5 Pro model, Gemini 1.5 Pro. Yeah, the names get me confused. Anyway, so this was like really wild, right? The big thing about this, as we've talked about before, million token context window, which is huge. Sundar Pichai says that you can put the entire Lord of the Rings trilogy in there. Also can upload video, things like that. So those were the things that I was testing the most, right? I just wanted to kind of see, like, is this actually everything that's kind of cracked up to be? And, the TLDR is like, yeah, actually it was pretty cool. So what I did was a couple of cool things, right? So the first one was, and I benchmarked this against GPT-4. So I uploaded a book that I wrote, sort of a fiction book that I wrote, which, after asking ChatGPT-4 knew that it existed. This was sort of like, a middle grade fiction book. And it, ChatGPT knew, a bunch about it. It knew, some characters, all that kind of stuff. But then it started to hallucinate a little bit on what it was. So I uploaded the entire book to make essentially like a kind of a RAG model out of this. And it was a 300-page book. And I said, hey, Gemini, tell me. And by the way, so others have done this. Ethan Mollick has done a lot of this. Like, a lot of people focus on, can it find the needle in the haystack, right? If you upload a book and you put like one line in there saying, oh, and then, and then in, 18th century England, there was an iPhone. Can it find that? And I think that's interesting. Mm-hmm. But I'm more interested in how does it read and comprehend? And so I uploaded this. And so my questions were, first, tell me the main characters. It did that. I think that's fairly straightforward. But then I started asking it, Jaden, I was like, tell me like where the plot twists were. Tell me where like, sort of a character was getting unexpectedly emotional or something. And then tell me like a character, who are the characters that you think are the funniest and why? Things like that, right? Which really required it to read and comprehend what it was looking at. Do you know what I mean? Like, think about that. Like, a plot twist is not like, a control F kind of function. And I'll tell you, it did an absolutely phenomenal job. I was like really blown away by that. So, and again, it's not just something that, you could do with anything, because this was 300 pages and it uploaded it within, I don't know, it's pretty slow. I'll say that, but let's say 25 seconds or whatever it took. So on that front, I thought it was awesome. I did try to upload videos because I wanted to see if it could sort of like, if it was actually watching a video or if it was just sort of like doing, like sort of like images, you know what I'm saying? Like, which is what, when it did its original demo for Gemini, that was one of the big problems with it. And I think it did a pretty good job there. So I took this video that was in Hanoi in Vietnam, all these motorcycles, right? Like sort of like doing, the traffic crossing, all that kind of stuff.
Okay.
And I asked some interesting things about that around how many do you think are in here? What's some interesting things? What might I not be noticing? And it did a pretty good job at that. But then other things it fell apart with when I tried to compare two videos. It couldn't see it, all that kind of stuff, a lot of hallucination. Anyway, long story short, I think that especially in terms of the context window, I think it's doing a great job. But the reason I'm not blown away, Jaden, I'll just say this finally, is that just feels like the next step for everybody is context window. I think that probably everybody can do big context windows now. Nothing about it really blew me away, but for what it said it did, it did.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and I think that's a very fair review. That's fascinating, first off, because beyond just what Google's doing, this is I think exciting for everyone listening. This is the AI Applied Podcast. How do we apply AI? For everyone listening, this is the next step that you will all be able to do with these AI tools as well. So I think that's really exciting. And like you said, I think that you have a good point, right? We had, ChatGPT had a small context window. This was something we kind of had to fight and struggle with. Claude came out and was like, hey, look, we got it was 130,000 or 128,000 character context window or token context window. So all of a sudden I was uploading big documents to Claude. Then OpenAI is like, no, look, we're coming out and making a bigger context window. Now Google is the top watchdog on the context window. I think you make a good point, which is at the end of the day, these context windows aren't like a fundamental innovation in technology. It's just like who wants to spend the most money to essentially have the most compute to do this, because more compute equals bigger context window. So I think it's cool that Google's kind of trying to be the leader and push this. And I think this is a smart move on Google's part, because in an area where it's hard to have a competitive advantage, it's hard to have a moat. There's the famous, memo from Google, last year where they said OpenAI doesn't have a moat and neither do we. Like everyone's kind of making these LLMs and some of them are a little better than others, but it feels marginal at this point, to say the least. So it's like, what is the moat? Well, the moat is who can spend the most money on the most compute to make a big context window. These are some things. So I think like well played on Google to do that. It's exciting to see that the AI technology is going there. I got to ask, what was the book that you put into Gemini? Was it Little Princes by Conor Grennan by chance? Because if not, shout out and plug to your phenomenal book. People should definitely read it.
Thank you. No, that's a memoir that I wrote that is kind of more widespread on the internet. So I purposely didn't use that because I didn't know if it would be just pulling off like term papers people wrote and stuff like that on it, because it got some widespread attention. No, this was a middle grade book called The Hadley Academy for the Improbably Gifted, which is like a book that I kind of always wanted to write, and shout out to HarperCollins for publishing it just a few years back. But it was one of these things where, it's not like people are like, writing a lot about it or anything like that. And that's why I wanted to use it to test it. And by the way, I agree. I mean, I think that this is like the moat could just be like, we have money to burn. And so it's like how, oil companies used to put people out of business. You know what I mean? It's just like, we're going to lower our prices until everybody else falls off. I don't think that's what's going to happen with AI. But I think you're right. There's definitely like just a smell test around this, around, what OpenAI keeps putting out, things like memory and GPTs and things like that. Like, it's still, Jaden, cranking ahead of Google. And when Google is even now, a year on, trying to sort of say like, hey, see this? It almost beats GPT-4. Jaden, you and I have been kind of harsh on Google, and we keep caveating this with like, never count out Google. And I don't. And I hate to sort of like throw leadership under the bus or anything, because it's like, again, it's not the coach's fault that the person fumbled or anything like that. And Google has phenomenal researchers, phenomenal engineers. They're an incredible company. They own all our data. And yet, right? I mean, like, how do you end up shutting down your image generator like over this? Like, this is not sort of like, oh, they got a gotcha moment. Like, this is an image generator that's generating sort of historically wildly inaccurate things in order to try to sort of like, include more diverse voices, which, by the way, as Jaden and I have talked about, totally applaud that. And I think DALL-E did it well. But guys, there has to be a middle ground here between historical inaccuracy and also trying to sort of, get bias kind of out of the system and everything like that. And it just feels like Google. And then they sent that memo, Jaden, I don't know if you saw that, where like somebody said, we're shutting down Google, Gmail. That was a big mistake. Anyway, just over and over again, for every step that Google seems to take, they take two steps back. And I don't know, Jaden, are they showing you anything yet? Are they turning a corner in your eyes? How are you feeling about this?
I think that this big context window might be one of their, I don't know. I hate to make a prediction on a company as big and powerful and, I don't know, as technically advanced as Google, but I think this context window might have been one of their big wins they'll take for a while. Like they're kind of beating everyone on that. That's exciting. That's useful, like as you've demonstrated. I think Google is going to go through a very interesting next year, I would say. It would appear their issues they had with Google Gemini and some of the issues and controversies that they had around that are more deep-setted in the whole company. I think a lot of people are talking about the fact that it wasn't just an issue for like Google Gemini, but like it's reflecting poorly on the entire Google company, because they're like, well, if these issues exist in Gemini, these weren't like a mistake or a flaw or a hack. They were intentional. They intentionally programmed it to do something specific, and the backlash that came publicly is why they're like apologizing and changing. But it would appear that, they were done out of the company's culture and what they just kind of do with all their products. And so that, I think, is going to be really interesting to see how this plays out. There's a lot of people with a lot of opinions on this, but I think Google is going to perhaps struggle. And I think it's not like Google. I think Google is just the word we're using today, but at the end of the day, this is a very common business problem. This is a very common business thing where it's like the big bloated company or government or like replace any organization, it gets too big, it gets too bloated, and it is just not as efficient. You have a little company like OpenAI, does not have a lot of employees, is able to drastically like outmaneuver them and front run some technology that's incredible and exciting. I mean, like Google, we're not even talking about like video generation yet. It's like Google has created this kind of Gemini product to compete with DALL-E, but like OpenAI's been doing DALL-E forever, and admittedly it's getting better and better, but like this is kind of Google's big hurrah into the image thing, and it's like everyone's already forgotten about this because we're already moving on to Sora with OpenAI and how crazy the video generation is, and they're like, we have this video generator, it's totally available, we don't know how to release it to everyone without it getting abused, but we have it. And like I just think Google is so big that maybe they're too big, maybe they're too bloated, maybe they need to make a smaller startup spin-off company that's unrelated. I think traditionally what would have happened in this whole situation is that they would have funded, or they would have had kind of these other smaller startup studios, and Google would start acquiring them. In today's environment, they can't even do acquisitions because we're not doing mergers. And I'm not saying whether that's good or bad either. Maybe there's some benefits to that as well. But I definitely think Google is going to be struggling for a while, and I don't know if they're going to be able to be dominant in this space just based off of the whole last year and everything that they've produced.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, like, look, they have DeepMind, they made that acquisition a while back, but like, I think you're right. I mean, I just see sort of like Google maybe just growing through acquisition, and not growing sort of in terms of size, but growing just in terms of innovation. And it's just, you're right. It's this innovator's dilemma, right? I mean, Google got here because they were like the small scrappy ones, and now they have 200,000 people. I just don't know how. I mean, again, at any moment they sort of like, it's like sort of like a slow heavyweight boxer who like all he needs is like, one massive uppercut. He could be losing like all 12 rounds otherwise. And maybe that's Google. Maybe they have something cooking, but it's hard to believe that they're doing more than, I mean, Microsoft is now partnered with Mistral. Like, obviously they have OpenAI. It's just funny that we're talking about places like Microsoft and, Meta and places like that as like the big innovators, and Google as the sort of like the laggards here. So I don't know. I'm also sort of more and more skeptical. I think Google needs to do something big to turn it around, and it feels like they've shot their shot a few times now and it hasn't gone well, and I'm starting to get skeptical. So we'll see where it goes.
It'll be fascinating. I think at the end of the day, my prediction for what it's worth is that we're going to be hearing some big announcements from Google, from their enterprise, their corporate team, their executive team, I guess. And I would not be surprised if Google, who's been kind of one of these companies that has kind of dodged and avoided a lot of these layoffs recently, does something like a big riff. They lay off 20% of their workforce. They try to get a little bit more lean. And I know this is not a topic a lot of people like to talk about, but I think sometimes it's important and helpful to cut the bloat in a company. You saw this from Meta. Meta did this earlier this year, and they completely changed. They tried to cut out middle management. And like, I hate to kudos Meta because it hasn't always been my favorite company, but like, you look at their stock price, look at their employees, look at their innovation, like they evidently have been quite successful in this regard. So, and this is, you could say Elon Musk with Twitter and what he did there. I know lots of people are, have controversies around that, but like evidently the company is more profitable and is still churning out new developments. So yeah, I think it's going to be interesting to see what happens with Google. That would be my prediction. I wouldn't be surprised if we see some shakeups on the executive front, and then if we see some big layoffs, I'm trying to get a little bit more lean and cut a little bit of bloat. So I'll be fascinated to see what happens.
I think so too. And just on that, just to sort of echo that, I think you're exactly right. I think that, we're now a year in. I think the people that, like the companies that have, everybody's sort of like taken their big swing already. We're no longer like waiting for somebody to weigh in. Even with Apple, I mean, maybe they'll come up with something, but yeah, I think Google is the one that's sort of like clearly falling behind. And you're right. Just like looking at the evidence, you can like these companies or not, but just watch for the ones that are doing well.
Yeah. Anyways, this has been a fascinating topic. Conor, thanks for sharing like your inside scoop on actually using Gemini. I think that's really useful for people to hear and to kind of know where the technology is at and where we're moving in the future with all AI models. To the listeners, thanks so much for tuning in. We love to have you, and we really appreciate all your support. If you could do us a huge favor, leave us a review. You probably heard us ask for it once or twice before, but honestly, it helps out a ton. If you're a new listener, it's the about section on Spotify. Drop us some stars on Apple. Same thing. If you're a longtime listener and don't have a review yet, today is your day. This is your moment. Time to make those stars shine. We really appreciate it. But we hope that you all have an amazing rest of your day.